So again, my name is Steve Davies, and today I'm representing the SPI, Society of the Plastics Industry Bioplastics Council. I will say up front that I'm the industry representative for the SPI this year, so I wear another hat, a day job, if you will, representing NatureWorks in public affairs and communications. So some of you may know me that way, but today we're representing the SPI's Bioplastics Council. Now, what Philip has just covered, I think, wonderfully kind of sets up what I'm going to go through. And just to introduce, first of all, what is the SPI Bioplastics Council? You can think of the SPI, the Society of the Plastics Industry, as a US counterpart across the pond from the British Plastics Federation. The SPI has some, I think, 700 plus industry members, and like the British Plastics Federation, about 3 years ago, for all the reasons that Philip mentioned, they formed a bioplastics group called the Bioplastics Council. And again, Philip nicely framed up the rationale for that, the confusion within the industry, the need for the still nascent bioplastics industry to speak with one voice and clarify things. So what Philip has covered, I think, wonderfully sets the trends and sort of market overview. And what I'm now going to go through is drill a bit more into the two key questions that we, as the SPI Bioplastics Council, keep getting asked, which is, please clarify what are bioplastics. Philip covered it, bio-based, biodegradable. I want to drill into that and try and bring some clarification to that. The other opportunity, if you will, in which SPI Bioplastics Council spends a lot of time is in talking about authentic and accurately marketing bioplastics through the value chain and to the consumer. So that's what I will also touch on. So very quickly, an overview of what I'm representing today, the Bioplastics Council, formed about 3 years ago. And we specifically went to some trouble, as it sounds like the British Plastics Federation has done, to not set up a distinct bioplastics association in the US. We wanted to house it within the umbrella of the conventional plastics industry. And that was why we put this within the SPI. So there are 3 different types of memberships. Probably easiest just to explain for you to see what these are. The core membership, of course, is the corporate member, the bioplastics producer, the bioplastics processor, and the folks that provide equipment. This is the major membership. There are other membership levels being set up as there's been a tremendous industry interest in this association. So we have possibility for brands, retailers, as well as individual membership, consultants, academia, government bodies, and other trade associations. So just to wrap up the introduction, we sound like we're about the same size as the British group. 6 core members, ranging from pure play bioplastics producers, like NatureWorks, like Metabolics, to large multinationals in many fields like DuPont, like BASF. So you can start to see some overlap, obviously, with what Phil described. We've grown already from 6 founding members to now 5 more, where we've started to introduce distributors and compounders in the bioplastic space. So I think that is more than enough on what the SPI, the SPI Bioplastics Council represents. What I want to get into now is the 2 core questions I set out to answer, which is clarifying what we mean when we say bioplastics. And before we answer that question, I think it's kind of instructive to talk about where are bioplastics. And again, you heard this beautifully from Philip. Right? Simply put, they're everywhere. In all walks of life, and all the products we take for granted, they're popping up. So, and you'll hear from some of the producers later in this conference today. In terms of what are bioplastics, simply put, some are bio-based, agricultural in origin, from carbon that was biogenic carbon that was, earlier in the atmosphere contributing to global warming, now locked up as the backbone of a polymer chain. Alternatively, bioplastics can be used to mean something completely different, nothing to do with where it's from, but where it goes, the whole biodegradable play. And herein lies the confusion we find in the polymers. Bioplastics can be one or the other or both. Indeed, the company I work for as well, NatureWorks, makes one that is both. The NGO polylactide is both bio-based, biodegradable in the right circumstance. I'm going to talk in detail around what we mean by that. Metabolics, another example with their PHA. It is both. It's fair to say, though, that most are not both, and this kind of gets to the confusion in the industry. In terms of bio-based materials, here we see a tremendous movement, as Philip covered, toward replacing non-renewable plastics, like, again, you heard already, Coke's plant bottle, where we're taking a material that has been around for decades, PET, and remaking it with a lower environmental footprint, remaking it so that it is, and we'll talk about what this percentage represents, because this is another cause of confusion, so that it's beginning to be partially bio-based. What Braskem is doing with their bio-based polyethylene, similar. For materials that are biodegradable, again, I'll define what I mean by that. These can be completely fossil-based. A good example is the material from BASF, PBAT, or the material from Mitsubishi, PBS. Not bio-based at all. Fossil-based materials that are biodegradable in various circumstances. So, what is key, I think, we found as the SPI Bioplastics Council is clarifying what you mean when you say bioplastics and backing it up with some third-party certification. So for bio-based certification, there is, and I'll give you the North American-based standard here, there is an ISO equivalent for bio-based carbon, ASTM 6866. And I should have said up front that due to the short time frame, what I'm going to represent in sort of the next 10 minutes is really a US view of the world, which I think is probably relevant for many of you who either sell it directly or export to the US. For biodegradable, degradation must be defined in terms of the environment. It can be compostable, it can be marine degradable, it can be soil degradable, and there are different standards for each of these. I want to make one point up front here. In terms of the SPI Bioplastics Council membership, we have drawn a line within SPI that this membership is our definition of bioplastics, as I've represented here, does not include things like the oxidodegradables. It's not a biodegradable route. And that is one core difference in our membership. And I won't be shy about saying there's quite a controversy in the industry about oxidogradable, about some of the claims being made. Not about the fundamental science, things do degrade, but in how that's being claimed in terms of the rate of degradation in the environment. And I should make clear that up front. So what I will talk about today is nothing to do with oxidodegradables. It's bioplastics as defined by bio-based or biodegradable. And let's drill into this now so you know exactly what I mean. So a biodegradable plastic is one that undergoes degradation by the action of microorganisms, bacteria, algae, fungi, something occurring naturally in the environment. I want to drill into this in more detail, because the term biodegradable plastic, in and of itself, is ambiguous. It's an incomplete definition. When you say biodegradable plastic, you need to get this right. You need to talk about two additional things. One, the environment in which it's degrading, and two, the time frame. And you can have drastically different environments, from industrial compost to home compost, to anaerobic degradation, to marine degradation, to the worst of the solutions, landfill. Completely different environments, different degradation routes, some with oxygen, some without. And the time frame is important. So what we strongly encourage is that no one talks about biodegradable plastic without also specifying where and how long. And that, frankly, simply said, is the frustration within the plastics industry around the oxidogradable claims. Is that sometimes, no argument with the science, but sometimes the definition of these two are left a little loose. So just to bring some more detail to this space, what I'm showing you here is all the different environments, the standard test method, and this is an ASTM test method, what is being measured, and then what can be claimed. And to be clear, this is some more sort of hand waving, if you will, that happens in the industry. But there are two sorts of standards. There's a test method that simply tells you how to run the test. If we're talking about what is the temperature outside today, this would tell you how to measure the temperature. And then there's a standard that tells you how to interpret the results. Not how to measure temperature, but what is the temperature, 20 degrees Celsius, for example. We find many people talk about that left-hand column, the test method, when what matters is the standard, pass-fail. And so the 6400 standard and the ISO equivalent are what are important, for example, for industrial compost. So for the second row here, marine degradation, completely different environment, a different standard, and these are the only two for which standards yet exist. Home compost, anaerobic degradation, there are test methods, but there are not yet standards set. Those are in development. And the same thing with characterizing what happens in landfill. So again, important when you talk about biodegradability that you do it carefully, quoting the standards, environment and time frame. So now let me switch away from biodegradation and talk about the other meaning of bioplastics, bio-based content. Simply put, this is the fraction of the carbon material which is new carbon, meaning carbon that was in the atmosphere contributing to global warming, now locked up as the carbon backbone of the polymer chain. And there is a standard method for this, ISO equivalence as well. And again, herein lies a little bit of confusion in the industry. For example, if one looks with this test at the Coca-Cola plant bottle and counts the carbon molecules, it's 20% bio-based. If one looks at the two monomers, one would get 30%. So again, paying attention to the standard is really critical. And I'm not trying to imply that Coke is saying it wrong. They're saying it in a simple way, but if you look at this standard, you're going to get a different number. So I want to just sort of map the bioplastic space now because I've covered a lot of information. And hopefully start to put some of the plastics you all will know on this sort of quadrant chart. So up and down the page, what I'm showing you is where the material comes from, what we call simply the beginning of life. Is it, at the bottom, is it fossil-based, natural gas, or oil-based, petroleum-based? At the top, is it bio-based? And then along the x-axis horizontally, we talk about where does the material go after it's used, the end of life. And we can map all the plastics out of today into this space. Of course, what we're all used to, long used to in the plastics industry, the polyolefins, PET, the nylons, the engineering plastics, are neither biodegradable nor compostable. They're fully fossil-based today, and that's beginning to change. At the other end of the extreme is materials like NatureWorks makes with the NGO polylactide, what Metabolics makes, and also local Chinese producers with PHA, and the thermoplastic starches, where they're both very high, these in particular are 100% bio-based and biodegradable. But of course you can have everything in between. Here are what we call the aliphatic aromatic copolyesters, things like what BASF make with the PBAT. These are today fossil-based, but biodegradable. Of course, you can have things that are in between, where these aliphatic aromatic copolyesters start to get blended with materials, so they're partially bio-based, still degradable. On the other side of the spectrum, you see, again, it's still nicely covered, bio-PET, what Coca-Cola and now Pepsi has announced that they're going to do, the same strategic intent to get into a bio-based PET. DuPont has long been making a bio-based PET, for example. And then if we go further up the top row, there are polymers that have long been around, like the nylon 11, and like bio-based polyethylene, where the ethylene is coming from ethanol. So this is essentially 100% bio-based, and of course not degradable. So this sort of the 6 quadrants here, I think, well, I hope get across why this could be a confusing space when one talks about bioplastics, those that are biodegradable, regardless of where they come from. This is the argument for, one of the arguments for using a biodegradable material, again, regardless of whether it's bio-based or not. I'm showing you here as an example, US data from the US EPA on landfill. What is in a landfill for the US as a whole? You can see roughly 13% of this is food scraps. What a biodegradable, specifically a compostable plastic, or an anaerobically degradable plastic will give you is an ability to remove that food waste from the landfill. And in Europe, there is a European directive to get food waste out of landfill, reduce methane generation, greenhouse gas generation from the landfill. And biodegradable materials offer an elegant way to do that. And the argument, I think, perhaps well known, but in any food processing, there is food waste, food residuals, food that can now go in with a biodegradable material. Material can go into a green bin, for example, with a compostable bag, and in a food serviceware facility, ideally this would be biodegradable compostable cutlery. And this whole bag and all of its contents, instead of going to landfill, can be composted. So that is the argument for biodegradable. And again, certification matters. In this case, biodegradable has to mean compostable per the standard I quoted, or anaerobically degradable, depending on where this is going to go. So let me switch to the last topic, which is the marketing of bioplastics. And through the entire value chain. For example, as Naturalist are a resin producer, as are many of the SPI Bioplastics members. We market to resin processors, and there are many, many sort of intermediaries before we get to the brand or retailer, including, of course, marketing to the final consumer. What's critical here for a bioplastic where one is interested in after consumer, the end of life, is we're not really only marketing the consumer, we're also marketing post-consumer, whether this is the composter or the municipal anaerobic degradation site, or the recycler that has to handle these new-to-the-world plastics. And post-consumer, these entities are typically sort of set either at the national level, state, county, or city dictates what these do, and they're a critical stakeholder in the introduction and commercialization of any bioplastic. What I want to give you, again, from a US perspective, is to the consumer, but also to the entire value chain. And this is the USDA, US Department of Agriculture, what they've just done, where they explain to the consumer. So, for those of you that may know the US Department of Agriculture, we've long had a label for food, on organic food stuff. There's also a similar label from the US Department of Energy for energy efficiency, called Energy Star. These labels have both been out for 10 years. They resonate because they're third party and authoritative about what they say about the product. It's what they call their bio-preferred label, which is the USDA certification of bio-based content in the product. Again, bio-based content, nothing to do with biodegradation or where the product goes after life. This is basically consistent with, in the US, the US has some legislation that was passed called the Farm Bill, that's gone through many iterations, but it's a strategic imperative for the US to make more of its products bio-based, to reduce dependence on foreign oil, to address global warming issues, and to promote this, the US government, through its Department of Agriculture, is now starting to promote bio-based content at the consumer level. And in Europe, there is something similar with Van Staat, is the organization that offers a bio-based carbon certification as well. To be clear, this bio-based bio-preferred product certification can apply to the product itself, it can apply to what it's packaged in, or it can apply to both. So last comment on green marketing. That USDA label was designed for use at the consumer level, but also through the entire value chain. Many of the converters, the processors, the manufacturers are using this label themselves. Naturalist, for example, is using it to market its own resin. An issue for this entire value chain is truth in marketing. Accurate, authentic marketing from B to B, business to business, and business to consumer. Comments in closing about that. In the US, the key agency is the Federal Trade Commission, called the FTC, which owns this issue and has long had in place some advertising guidelines for green marketing. Marketing claim is subject to the FTC Guidelines. The FTC has been revising its guidelines for the last couple of years, and the SPI Bioplastics Council and other trade associations have been commenting on those guidelines before they issue. I'll go into this in a little more detail, but the long and short of it is that the FTC strenuously, strongly recommends staying away from general claims. They want specific claims, ASTM or international equivalents to those. So what I'm going to show you now are just some slides from the FTC, from one of their lawyers that have been presented several times at conferences, where they talk about guidance around environmental benefits, around marketing degradable and biodegradable, compostable, recyclable, and they also give recommendations on recycled content. The FTC is quite clear. Basically, avoid them. They give the example of plastic and PVC with a general umbrella claim like environmentally friendly. And the FTC's guidance is stop. Don't make such broad claims. Say what you mean. Say that it's recycled content or that it's bio-based. Be very specific. For biodegradable, the FTC has very strong opinions and guidance on this. They strongly recommend against this as a general claim because it can be so misleading. And even when it is true, their point is that most things that even if they do biodegrade per one of those earlier definitions I gave you, generally will not biodegrade in a landfill, which is where most products end up. So the FTC's guidance is misleading the consumer. And here's an example where the FTC has stepped in and basically forced a manufacturer to take the product off the shelf. This is now quite an old example, and I'll give you some more recent ones. But here is a disposable diaper that was being mismarketed as biodegradable. There were two issues here. One, the product didn't biodegrade by any standard. But two, even if it did, the FTC's point was it won't biodegrade in landfill, stop marketing it. Compostability, the FTC also has some very clear guidance, which is you have to specify if you're going to say industrially compostable per the standard I gave you earlier, you need to check that the facilities exist. And often they do not. So again, very... Let me just wrap up by giving you some specific examples of enforcement behind this, the consequences of what they simply call deceptive marketing practices. The National Advertising Division in the US is an independent body that basically steps in and takes misclaims in the market. They're backed up by the FTC. And I've just pulled from NAD, as they're known, the National Advertising Division's website, a couple of the recent cases they've put forth and concluded. And quite controversial in the industry, the whole oxo-degradable space, where no argument about the science, frankly, about the way the claims are being marketed. NAD has gone after specific manufacturers listed here and asked them to stop, change what they're doing. So the first couple are about oxo-degradable, the last couple are around too loose of a definition of what's meant by biodegradable. So for us, for the SPI and all plastics manufacturers, very welcome, I think, in that it brings a lot more rigor to the claims that we all sort of live and die by as plastics manufacturers. So we welcome this, and it's one reason the SPI and its members are so process. So it really covers what I wanted to cover. So background, a deeper drill on what bioplastics represent, bio-based, biodegradable, and then how to accurately market them. So I think there's some time for questions at the end. And again, I thank the organizers for inviting the SPI, and thank you all for your attention.